Hello and welcome to our channel. Today we will share the story of a serial killer, child rapist Pedro Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes. He is claimed to have killed 300 young girls, which makes him the most brutal child killer of the 20th century. Lopez was born in 1948 in Tolima, Colombia during the most troubled times for South America region at that time. Most South American countries were engulfed in political and economic crises in that period of time, with riots erupting due to lack of domestic peace. Pedro was born into poverty. His mother was a penniless sex worker who had 13 children and would often beat them. To handle his inner struggles, Pedro would often resort to streets where he would spend most of his time. In 1957, at the age of 8, Pedro tried to have sexual intercourse with his 7-year-old sister. His mother caught him and kicked Pedro out of the house. The 8-year-old boy was now left in the street all alone. He was alone amid this chaos. He followed an old man who offered him help. However, the man had evil intentions. He took Pedro to an abandoned place where he first beat him, then raped him repeatedly and abandoned him. Pedro encountered the bitter realities of the street life in a very painful way, after which he spent 1 year in the street, avoiding people and sleeping in closed places. He would feed himself with whatever he found in garbage bins. Finally, he left for the city of Bogotá, where he tried to survive by begging for food. Once, an American couple who saw him begging took him to their home, washed him, and gave him new clothes. Then they enrolled him in a school for orphans. Pedro started school. For the first time in his life, everything was going well for him. For 3 years, he had regular meals and clean clothes. When he was 12, one of the teachers at school took Pedro to an empty classroom and raped him. Pedro's good life was turned upside down again. Pedro stole money from the school and left without saying anything to anyone. The civil war in the country was over, and things were back to normal. There were new workplaces, but none of these were of any use to Pedro. He didn't have any job. He spent 6 years begging for food and stealing on the streets. Pedro didn't make friends with anyone. He didn't trust anyone. All he knew was to steal, and he was very good at it. He was 18 years old when he was caught and sentenced to 7 years in jail for stealing cars. Just 2 days after he went to prison, he was raped again by 4 men and was severely beaten while resisting them. When Pedro regained his consciousness, he never let anyone do that to him again. Within 2 weeks, he killed the 3 of his rapists with a sharp knife. The 4th man escaped from prison when he realized that he was next in line to be killed. This crime resulted in his sentence being extended by 2 years. Pedro Lopez suffered immensely during the 9 years he spent in prison. Pedro had never had a relationship with any woman until that moment. In 1978, Pedro Lopez was released from prison. He longer felt belonging to anywhere. He traveled to many parts of South America, wandering in the highlands of Peru. Based his own confessions, he committed his first murder in Peru, where he kidnapped and then murdered nearly 100 young girls and children from indigenous South American tribes living in the highlands. The only known incident in the official records of these days was when Pedro was caught while kidnapping a 9-year-old girl from a tribe. He was tortured by the tribesmen. After capturing Pedro, the tribesmen stripped him naked and first tortured him and then tried to burn him alive. An American missionary woman who lived near the area at the time told the tribe that what they were doing would be disapproved by God and suggested they hand the man over to the police. The tribesmen listened to her and handed Pedro over to the police station in the nearest town. However, the court did not want to deal with the problems of the indigenous people, and Pedro was deported from the country through the Ecuadorian border crossing. Soon Pedro started wandering between Ecuador and Colombia, and the Ecuadorian police force started receiving reports of missing girls. The police never presumed that only one man was behind all these crimes, as there were too many cases of kidnapping and sex slavery committed by gangs in the region. In April 1980, the areas around Ecuador's Ambato region were hit by flooding that caused large-scale landslides. After the rain stopped, residents reported 4 bodies to the police. Police and forensic workers immediately went to investigate the bodies that belonged to young girls. The corpses were decomposed beyond recognition. The investigation revealed that victims had been killed. It was a murder. Once a woman living in Ambato was shopping in the market with her 13-year-old daughter when she noticed a man following them. The woman turned back and immediately the man tried to abduct the girl and flee. The horrified woman screamed, and the people nearby were able to catch Pedro and take the girl from him. Police was called to the scene of the incident and took Pedro to police station. Pedro refused to cooperate with the police. He remained silent throughout the entire interrogation, which meant that he admitted to all his crimes. Unable to get any response from Pedro, police resorted to another solution. They found a priest and placed him in the cell with Pedro. Their goal was to get Pedro to confess to the priest. The priest would then tell the police everything he heard one by one. Pedro Lopez confessed his crimes, telling that he had killed 110 girls in Ecuador, 100 in Colombia, and more than 100 in Peru. He blamed his crimes on the horrible life he had lived and the life he had spent alone. "I lost my innocence at the age of 8. Terrible things were done to me, and I decided to do the same thing to as many little girls as I could." Pedro would commit his crimes in daytime as he wanted to see his victims' faces. He would first rape and then kill the kidnapped girls while looking into their eyes as he killed them. Realizing that the detectives did not believe him and were skeptical of his narrative, Pedro offered to show them the locations of the dead bodies. When the team of investigators visited the places described by Pedro, they were terrified. They found the bodies of 53 girls after Pedro directed them to the places where they were buried. Some of the graves were empty, but the investigators presumed that it might have been due to flooding or the bodies might have been eaten by animals. It was now clear that he had killed 110 people in Ecuador. Pedro Lopez's trial began in 1980. The trials were very short since he confessed to all his crimes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, the severest punishment in the country's legal system back then. The monster of the Andes spent 18 years in solitary confinement and was released in 1998, taking into account his good behavior in prison. The decision enraged the public and a $25,000 bounty was placed on his head. No one knows where Pedro Lopez went after the release. He was allegedly killed in Ecuador, but a year later he was recaptured in Colombia, where he was placed in a mental institution for 3 years and was released again. No one knows what happened to the monster of the Andes. He is 76 now and may be out there somewhere, or he may be dead by now.